Welcome to the Bare Metal Cybersysm Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical context. Contracts play a critical role in modern information security governance. In a world where organizations rely on a complex network of vendors, partners, and third parties, contracts define enforceable expectations for how sensitive data, systems, and services are protected. Security clauses embedded in contracts are not just legal language. They are formal extensions of your organization's security policies. These clauses help ensure that external relationships uphold the same standards and protections that apply internally. As a CISM-certified leader, overseeing the inclusion and enforcement of these contractual requirements is a core part of your management responsibilities. Security agreements must be designed with the organization's risk tolerance in mind. If an organization has a low tolerance for downtime or data loss, those expectations must be reflected clearly in contract language. Conversely, organizations operating in higher risk environments may accept more flexible terms, but only with proper controls in place. Either way, the terms must be realistic, enforceable, and aligned with operational capability. Contracts are not standalone documents. They are binding instruments that should integrate with your policies, procedures, and control environment. There are several types of security agreements that appear frequently in security and vendor management contexts. Service-level agreements, or SLAs, define performance and availability standards for services provided by internal or external parties. These may include uptime guarantees, response times, and issue resolution windows. Non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, are used to protect the confidentiality of shared information, especially during early-stage business discussions or projects. They define what information is considered confidential and how it should be handled. Data processing agreements, or DPAs, are particularly important when dealing with personal data under privacy regulations like GDPR. These contracts outline how data will be processed, where it will be stored, and who is responsible for specific privacy obligations. Master Service Agreements, or MSAs, provide a broad framework for long-term relationships between organizations. They establish baseline terms that apply to all future statements of work or project agreements. Acceptable Use Agreements, or AUAs, regulate how employees, contractors, or partners may access and use systems and data. They define behaviors that are allowed or prohibited to minimize misuse. Many contracts include detailed security clauses that define exactly how information and systems must be protected. These clauses often start with requirements around data handling, for example, requiring encryption at rest and in transit, data minimization, and defined retention periods. Contracts may also require specific access control provisions, such as multi-factor authentication or strict role-based permissions. Incident response obligations are another key element. These may specify notification timelines, such as informing the organization of a breach within 20 or 72 hours, and escalation procedures for different incident types. Other security clauses include rights to audit. These allow the organization to inspect systems, request compliance documentation, or even conduct formal assessments. This helps ensure vendors are not only agreeing to terms but are also implementing them effectively. Termination clauses may define procedures for securely destroying or transferring data once a contract ends. If these details are missing, it becomes difficult to ensure data is no longer stored, replicated, or processed outside your control. Well-written contracts must anticipate these end-of-life scenarios to avoid residual risk. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Aligning external contractual terms with internal security policies is essential to maintaining audit integrity and operational continuity. If your contracts promise encryption, access controls, or 24/7 monitoring, your actual operations must be capable of delivering those outcomes. When internal controls fail to support contractual commitments, audit findings, penalties, or reputational damage can follow. Security teams must validate operational alignment before contract execution. Simply signing the agreement is not enough. You must ensure readiness to fulfill all obligations. Discrepancies between policy and contract language create ambiguity and potential legal exposure. For instance, if a contract defines breach differently than your internal policy, confusion can delay response and notification. Security professionals must ensure consistent terminology and expectations across all documents, especially those that involve regulatory reporting. In addition, contract terms must reflect the current state of your environment. If security controls or capabilities have changed, contract updates are required to reflect reality. Legal and regulatory compliance must also be embedded in contractual terms. Contracts involving personal data should include clauses that reflect applicable laws such as GDPR, HIPAA, or the CCPA. For example, some regulations mandate that contracts specify breach notification timelines or prohibit offshore data transfers without safeguards. Regulatory frameworks may also require that organizations perform due diligence on vendors and maintain audit records. If required clauses are omitted, contracts may be considered non-compliant or even unenforceable under certain jurisdictions. Jurisdictional laws are especially relevant for international operations. Contracts must identify which laws govern the agreement, especially when data crosses borders. If this is unclear, enforcement may be compromised in a legal dispute. Legal review should be built into every stage of the contract lifecycle, from drafting through negotiation to renewal and termination. Security leaders must collaborate with legal counsel to ensure that security-specific clauses are enforceable and aligned with evolving laws. Security responsibilities in third-party agreements must be explicitly defined. Contracts should clarify which party owns specific controls, who is responsible for monitoring them, and how compliance will be verified. Without this clarity, assumptions can lead to gaps. Assigning accountability is critical. This includes not only who is responsible for daily execution, but also who reports performance metrics and who responds when issues arise. Many organizations work with subcontractors or fourth parties through larger vendors. Contracts must specify how these downstream entities are vetted, monitored, and held accountable. It's also important to build in requirements for continuous improvement. Vendors should not be allowed to meet minimum requirements indefinitely. There should be periodic reassessments to reflect changes in risk, business needs, or threat environments. Auditability is another core requirement. If vendors are unwilling or unable to provide evidence of control effectiveness, the relationship may expose your organization to undue risk. Contracts are also tools for transferring and allocating risk. By clearly defining responsibilities and consequences, organizations can limit exposure and ensure shared accountability. For example, a contract might shift responsibility for data loss to a vendor, requiring them to carry cyber liability insurance. Insurance clauses should specify minimum coverage amounts, types of policies required, and documentation standards. Indemnification clauses protect your organization from financial losses resulting from the vendor's negligence or failures. Limitations of liability are another common feature. These clauses cap the vendor's financial exposure in the event of a breach or dispute. While these limits may be necessary to close deals, they must also reflect the actual risk to your organization. Low caps on liability and high-risk relationships can leave the organization exposed. Finally, responsibility for legal violations, such as data breaches or regulatory fines, must be clearly assigned. If accountability is vague, legal enforcement becomes difficult, and recovery efforts can stall. Security professionals must be actively involved in contract review and negotiation processes. Waiting until after a contract is signed to raise concerns is too late. Before signature, security teams should ensure that terms are clear, enforceable, and consistent with the organization's risk appetite. Avoid vague language that lacks definitions or performance thresholds. Words like reasonable or as appropriate can lead to conflicting interpretations and limited recourse during disputes. Security teams should also ensure that contractual terms are reviewed against internal standards, not just legal boilerplate. Contracts that fall short of security expectations should be flagged, and exceptions should be documented for further review. These exceptions may require additional controls, monitoring, or risk acceptance. Tracking these exceptions in a central repository supports governance, audit readiness, and informed decision-making. Contract governance is not only about legal approval, it is a security discipline that supports accountability and strategic alignment. Once contracts are in place, they must be monitored for compliance. This requires mechanisms to track whether vendors and partners are fulfilling their security obligations over time. Reporting and attestations can provide visibility, especially when regular audits are impractical. These reports should be reviewed carefully and compared against contractual terms to identify gaps or red flags. In some cases, full assessments or on-site audits may be necessary. Violations must be addressed promptly and consistently. Contracts should define escalation procedures for security breaches, policy violations, or performance failures. Delayed responses increase risk and reduce the effectiveness of contractual protections. A centralized inventory of active agreements, their terms, and their compliance status helps maintain oversight. This inventory should include renewal dates, responsible parties, and any open compliance issues. Finally, security agreements must be reviewed, updated, and retired in a controlled and secure manner. Over time, threats evolve, regulations change, and operational practices shift. Contracts that were appropriate 2 years ago may now be outdated or even non-compliant. Periodic review cycles should be built into the vendor management program to ensure that contract language reflects current expectations. Renewals provide an opportunity to renegotiate legacy clauses or strengthen weak protection. Termination procedures must also be carefully managed. Contracts should define how data is returned, transferred, or destroyed, and by whom. These steps are critical to avoid unauthorized retention or exposure after the relationship ends. Retired agreements must be archived securely with classification and retention schedules based on legal, regulatory, and operational requirements. A lifecycle approach to contractual security ensures that your agreements are not only active controls, but also part of a larger governance and risk strategy. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cybersysm Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.